Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Ed Mechmann. I'm the director of the Public Policy Office and also the Safe Environment Office at the Archdiocese. I'm an attorney, and I've been doing public policy work, legislative analysis, litigation, things like that for a really long time. I won't tell you how long. This is Alexis Tracey. She is my associate at the Public Policy and Safe Environment Offices. She's also an attorney. Obviously of newer vintage than me, but Alexis is also the coordinator and facilitator of the Discussion Discipleship group, which has a monthly meeting very often here, discussing all sorts of interesting topics, and I see a number of friendly faces, familiar faces here, including her husband who's hiding in the back.
Anyway, thank you. Thank you, Debbie. Thank you all of you from the Goretti Group and also members of Discussion Discipleship for coming out tonight. So as you've heard probably from the advertisements, we're going to talk a little bit about legalized prostitution and the Catholic perspective. It's a very controversial topic. We're obviously going to touch on church teaching, then also delve into a little bit of the legal issues, legislation surrounding the topic. We're also going to talk about the connection with pornography, what we should do about it going forward, and then we leave some time for question and answer. Now, normally with discussion and discipleship, it's interactive in the sense that we'll read a document and then talk and go back and forth. But for this discussion tonight, we're going to try to give you an overview. We're going to discuss the topic in depth, and then for the rest of the time, we're very much interested in hearing your thoughts, comments, and questions.
And also, because this is a difficult topic, I should probably give a little bit of a trigger warning. We're going to talk about some unpleasant things, so just don't be too shocked or scandalized if we say things that are very upsetting, because the reality of the world of prostitution is and should be very upsetting and appalling to ordinary, normal people.
So again, I'm sure that this is not a surprise to any of you, but I think it's important to start this discussion with some basic Catholic principles. And what are they? And one of the most basic principles is obviously all humans are made in the image and likeness of God. Everyone has intrinsic value and worth. Everyone is to be treated with dignity and respect. That's again a fundamental principle that we all know. Likewise, what do we mean? Well, what does the church really teach in terms of sexuality? So our sexuality is a gift. It's something sacred. And the proper use of that, of the gift of sex, of the gift of sexuality, is obviously between man and woman in marriage. But then how does prostitution distort that, and what does that mean? So obviously prostitution is dealing with the buying and selling of sex. But that's a bit complicated from the Catholic perspective, because really, inherently, by its nature, sex is really not something that can be bought or sold, at least if you're appealing to a Christian or a Catholic understanding of what sexuality is, what it's for, etc., etc.
Right. If you're buying it, it's not a gift anymore. Right? A gift should be something that's freely given out of a desire to show love to another person, especially in marriage.
Yeah, I think from that, when we get into this larger idea of sex work and what does that mean, and if you're thinking of sex work as some sort of legitimate profession, is that then masking a lot of these psychological harms, a lot of physical, all these different types of harms that are involved in prostitution? Is that masked under the guise of legalized prostitution?
So it's really important, I think, that we have it clear in our mind when we talk about what prostitution is and what it is that we as people who are hopefully not engaged in sex work, what is it that we owe to the people who are in prostitution? Because we all are united as children of God, we all are in relationship with each other. And each of us as individuals, and certainly also as a society, we have obligations to each other. And when we think about these women and men who are involved in the sex industry, who are involved in prostitution, pornography, and so forth, there really is a fundamental question that we have to ask ourselves, and that's a question of justice. Are we giving these people what is due to them? Are we giving them what is their right to have? And as children made in the image and likeness of God, we all have a right to dignity. We all have a right to productive work. We all have a right to be in relationship of equality and not of exploitation with others. So from the Catholic perspective, we have to make sure we keep that in the larger picture, and also not forget that each one of us has an obligation in this area to consider our relationship and our involvement with these people who are in this industry.
Yeah. Now, when we talk about prostitution, specifically in both legalized and illegal context, we have to think about who actually are these prostitutes or these sex workers. And predominantly speaking, they're women, sometimes even girls, if it's just totally, outrageous. Sometimes they're even minors, but it's women from indigenous communities, immigrant communities that are low income. There's also a large portion of Asian women that are coming from, let's say, massage parlor work, and then from there they go into prostitution. There's other women that are somehow involved, let's say, in the foster care system. Previously, maybe they were in foster care, then they're leaving it. A lot of women that are coming from very difficult backgrounds, women that are coming from both abuse, whether that's abuse of drugs, but also sexual abuse. And they're entering prostitution, really not necessarily by choice because they want to, It's not like I have a choice between going to Harvard and going into prostitution, but because they feel that this is their only option to make money, perhaps there's nothing else to do. So we're really looking at a very vulnerable group, a very, very vulnerable population.
Yeah, and you're also, I think our society very often is misled by the media, by movies and so forth, into thinking that this is a free choice, completely free and a completely rational choice that's being made. It's just another profession. And that may be true for a very tiny number of people. But
the
vast majority, we tend to talk of women, but of course there's a lot of men and transgender people who are involved in prostitution. We're just going to generally talk about women, though. I think
that's the largest.
Yeah, but this is, I guess, Alexis said, this is not something that people freely, rationally choose. It is almost always a decision made out of desperation, and it is almost always a decision that is made in the context of exploitation and force and coercion. There is no such thing as an honorable pimp or panderer. They are exploiters. And the vast majority of people who go into prostitution are victims.
Yes. Now again, before we talk a little bit legally, I do want to, hit home in terms of, again, Catholic principles. And for those of you that come to D&D, I like to talk about church documents. So I really am going to read directly from the Catechism, the short paragraph on what prostitution is and what the church teaches. So this is in the Catechism, section 2355, and it says, prostitution does injury to the dignity of the person who engages in it, reducing the person to an instrument of sexual pleasure. The one who pays sins gravely against himself. He violates the chastity to which his baptism pledged him and defiles his body, the temple of the Holy Spirit. Prostitution is a social scourge. It usually involves women, but also men, children, and adolescents. The latter two cases involve the added sin of scandal. While it is always gravely sinful to engage in prostitution, the imputability of the offense can be attenuated by destitution, blackmail, or social pressure. So that's really what the church is teaching about prostitution in and of itself. And because Ed had alluded to it, I'm also going to read you now quotes from two prostitutes. They were prostitutes that were engaged in prostitution in a legal context, so in countries in which it was legal. And again, these are a little bit vulgar, but from the outside, I think that we should really confront and see what this really is. So this is from one prostitute, former prostitute, sex worker. Her name is Cassandra. And then this is what she reflects on her experience and says, I was no more than girl number 4. Valued only for my outward appearance and the ability to please customers. I regularly saw 12 to 14 men per night. I was punched, slapped, bitten, and worse, all in the name of my so-called job. My customers wanted the porn star experience, things that they wouldn't do with someone they loved or respected. My story is not an uncommon one, but what you need to know is that this abuse is occurring right in your community, and you're likely not even aware. And then another sex worker, Jade, she says, I was at the mercy of the clients. I would be left with bruises all over my body from the rough sex. Men always wanted to imitate hardcore porn, acting out the sexual violence they were feeding on. The drunker they were, the angrier they would get until they were in hateful rages. Those were the times my vagina would bleed from the trauma. I had no one to tell or to help me, as we, the girls, were experiencing the same thing. And that's from Jade. Very, very violent, exploitive.
Right. And about as far from an act of love as you can get.
Imagine. So then the question is, okay, so what do we do about this, and how do we think about this from the Catholic perspective? So obviously, the morality is clearly evident and settled. I mean, the church is never going to say that this is something that's morally good, morally right. But then the issue is legalization. So, should it be totally made illegal? Should it be decriminalized to a certain extent? Should it be kept? There's multiple different options between letting it be totally permitted versus totally outlawed. But I think from the Catholic perspective, the ultimate goal of what the church really sees is this is not something that's good. This is not something that we want. Ideally, we want a society in which there is no prostitution or nobody wants that. But how then do you achieve that in a fallen world? How then do you discourage it? And what are the ways to do that in a legal context?
Right. Or one of the ways that we Catholics think about the role of the government in society is to, first of all, protect us, protect our dignity and our persons against exploitation and violence. But also one of the traditional understandings of the role of government and law is to help people lead good, happy lives, productive lives where they can develop to their potential. And the idea is, under that theory of law, that you encourage certain kinds of behavior, and you discourage others. So that's why marriage traditionally has been a privileged place under the law, because we want to encourage people to get married because it's good for us. And on the other hand, we want to forbid prostitution because it's bad for people, it's bad for everybody. Now, what Alexis referred to, though, is the problem that in this fallen world, the law can't always make those decisions cleanly and perfectly, because there's always a calculation involved. The good that we do by a law, is it outweighed by the damage that we might do by that same law, sort of the law of unintended consequences. The classic example was prohibition of alcohol here in the United States. Did a lot of good, but there was also a lot of bad that came from it. And it was a difficult decision on the part of the government and on the part of Catholics, whether it's worth it. And the same thing with prostitution, even back to St. Thomas Aquinas discussing this, which Alexis' favorite subject.
Yeah. So obviously there's a question of things that are immoral versus things that are illegal. So everything that's immoral, should it also be illegal? And I'm sure some of you know, Aquinas does have this principle of toleration, where he says, we reasonably tolerate certain evils in order to prevent greater evils or to prevent a greater good from being lost. Now, does that actually, when applied in our context now, does that reign out true for prostitution? Well, that's to be seen. We'll talk about that now, but that's the framework in which Aquinas was thinking about it, and a little bit about how the church thinks about it.
Yeah. And the advocates for the legalization of prostitution only talk about what they perceive as the positive benefits. They don't talk about, or they deny, the negative consequences of the legalization, or basically the perpetuation and encouragement of prostitution. So this is one of the great things about Aquinas. You have to take both parts into account and make a prudential decision about it.
Yeah, but let's talk about, I guess, New York State. What's the current state of things? So under the penal law, Article 230 of the penal law, prostitution is illegal in New York State. And it's not just prostitution, but patronizing a prostitute, any type of, let's say, pimping, all those types of establishments for prostitution, that's all illegal in New York State. Now, I don't know if you want to get this. Now the question also is, okay, even though we've pretty much outlawed it, are these laws being enforced? And,
yeah. I was going to say, prostitution is a hard law to enforce. I was a prosecutor here in Manhattan many years ago, and it's very difficult to prosecute the prostitutes and the pimps and the patronizers, right, the so-called Johns. You have problems of, well, who's the witness? How do you gather the evidence? One of the ways that traditionally street prostitution was fought against was through a law that was called loitering for the purposes of prostitution. Basically, people hanging out on the street, calling out to cars, skimpily dressed, making propositions to people. And the police were able to use that law to sweep the street clear of the prostitutes. Now, unfortunately, they would wind up usually being back out there the next night. It's hard to tell exactly what good that did. It usually gave the girls a criminal record. They usually got very little time served. And it didn't go against the demand side, which is the Johns, the patronizers. They were rarely arrested. And it didn't get the pimps, who are the people who are the promoters of it, the ones that are forcing the girls and intimidating the girls. Now, last year, the state legislature got rid of that law, the loitering for prostitution law, so it is no longer possible for the police to go out on the street and sweep up the street free from the prostitutes. And you can imagine what it must be like to live in an area where this is going on. And this has been talked about in the newspapers over the last year or so. People are appalled all of a sudden that there's noise, there's people driving around in their cars, there's crime, there's garbage, there's drugs, there's all sorts of horrible things going on in the neighborhood, and the police have very little authority or power to stop it.
So enforcement, though, is a bit of an issue because there's 3 levels involved. So you're enforcing a law, you're trying to, I guess, get in trouble the actual prostitutes themselves, which can be a bit controversial because these are, vulnerable women. Then, of course, you're going after, like Ed was saying, both the buyers, the Johns, and then also the pimps. And it seems to be that, at least the way that the law is being enforced now, if it's even being enforced, there's only it seems to be that it's easy to go against the prostitutes as opposed to the buyers and the pimps. And that's where there's a bit of an issue. Right. I mean, again, now, not enforcing anything at all is not really solving the problem here. But it seems to be that if you're going to have a context in which, prostitution is criminalized, you have to be going after the pimps and the Johns. Like, that's just how it is. And if you're not doing that, then your criminal laws are failing because they're not being enforced. And that's a little bit of the context that we're having now.
Yeah, and really, if you're only selectively prosecuting one part of the industry, the actual prostitutes on the street, it's really a hypocritical way of going about law enforcement. Because you're essentially saying, we're going to go after the low-hanging fruit, right, the most easy people to go after. We're going to burden them with criminal records, but we're not going to do anything against the people who are profiting, the people who are forcing, and so forth. It's really hypocritical. Some of the DAs here in New York, both Brooklyn and Manhattan, for example, have basically said they're not going to prosecute anybody for prostitution anymore. Even though the laws are on the books, they're just going to ignore the prostitution laws. They do say, oh no, of course we're going to prosecute sex trafficking, which we can talk about in a second, but the reality is that sex trafficking is indistinguishable from mainstream prostitution. Sex trafficking is not what a lot of people think it is. Importing women from China or from Eastern Europe or from South America.
But it's not necessarily.
Right, that's what gets people's attention, and it's a terrible worldwide problem, there's no question about it. But the definition in the law of sex trafficking is using force, intimidation, coercion, abuse of drugs and things like that to get someone to engage in prostitution. That's the business model of pimps. It's indistinguishable. Sex trafficking is indistinguishable from the vast majority of the ways that pimps operate. So by saying you're not going to prosecute promoting, which is pimping, you're only going to prosecute sex trafficking, you're lying to us. And again, you're being hypocritical. You're saying you're really not going to prosecute basically what everybody does, and they're not. According to the Office of Court Administration, in 2020, there were only 100 prosecutions in the whole state of New York for compelling permitting or promoting prostitution, and only 14 for sex trafficking. Those are statistics of failure, right? And indifference to the suffering that's going on. According to the Manhattan DA's office, in 2021, there were 22 arrests in the whole county of New York, the whole borough of Manhattan, for any prostitution-related offense. 22? Come on. Every massage parlor, it's going on, and it's going on out in the streets. It's going on the call out from Craigslist and online and so forth. 22. And it's disgraceful. One of the reasons that you want to prosecute cases and even prosecute the prostitutes is that it provides you with a point of contact with them that may allow them an escape hatch. It's not just to punish that you want to arrest and prosecute them. You want to give them a chance to encounter the court system and to give them a chance to find a way out of that life. The vast majority of prostitutes, when surveyed, say they don't want to do this. They never wanted to go into it. They were forced, coerced, whatever, and they would love to get out of it, but they don't see a way. New York State set up these human trafficking intervention courts, where the courts will refer you and even mandate that the prostitute go to counseling, go to other services and so forth. It's not used anywhere near as much as it could, but it's sort of a model of why you want to have this point of encounter. And if you legalize prostitution, you will never have that point of encounter with the girls on the street.
So again, to that point about legalizations, obviously we're in this context in which whether the laws are not being enforced. So then that leads a lot of people to think, well then, why bother having these laws, criminal laws in the first place? Let's just have it all be legalized, completely decriminalized, etc., etc. They do that in several other countries. Now, some of this could be coming from a good place, because they view, again, these women as exploited, and there's a theory that if it's legalized, then it would be safer, it would be more respectable, there would be less violent, etc. But on the other hand, there are some people that are seeking to legalize it for what I view as not beneficent reasoning, in the sense that, well, they just view it as there should be no restrictions on sex, you should be able to have sex whenever and whomever, the law should not be involved in it, and this is just fine. So on both, when people are talking about legalization, there's different perspectives. But in New York State, there's one bill that's most notably being put forward now. It's called the Stop Violence the Stop Violence in the Sex Trades Act, and that's by Gottfried and Salazar. There's another one as well, but that's the main law, the main bill that's being considered now.
Yeah, Dick Gottfried is a long-standing, actually he's retiring finally, thank God, long-standing member of the New York State Assembly, and Julia Salazar is a member of the State Senate from the Bronx.
And if that bill were to be passed, that would be the most comprehensive legalized framework in the United States. And it really is calling for legalization on all different fronts. I mean, I'm going to cite some of the provisions. They would repeal criminal provisions against prostitution buying, promoting the prostitution of a person over 18 years old, and the running of brothels and commercial sex establishments. So that would be a very, very radical concept, and that is something that's currently being considered in New York. Now, I think, though, in order to have an informed opinion and perspective on this, we should just delve into, I know not everyone here is aware, but just delve into some of what the bill is saying. And I think the first part we need to think about is this regulatory aspect. So if you're in a context in which prostitution is illegal, period. Now again, that doesn't touch enforcement, prostitution is illegal. But for this bill, if this were to become law, it would create a distinction between illegal and legal prostitution. Now, the bill itself doesn't provide guidance as to how we would regulate it, so that would be left ultimately up to local and city authorities.
Department of Health or Department of Consumer Affairs.
That's to be seen, but now you are creating a context in which there's legal and illegal prostitution. And as with everything, is that going to be necessarily good? Because if you're going to make that dichotomy, and if there is something that is still going to be considered illegal versus legal, well then who then is going to fall in the category of the illegal side of things? It probably will be then the most vulnerable, the most oppressed. Because once you're making that distinction, it's not always going to have a good outcome.
Right, and part of the question too is profitability. See, right now, prostitution is enormously profitable. There's no regulation and there's no taxation either, right? Nobody's being taxed on their prostitution income, even though according to the IRS, it is taxable income. If it's regulated, it will be regulated. There will be inspections, there are going to be requirements, and there will be taxes. So the question is, will it be profitable to continue doing that, to do that regulated? Or will it be more profitable to be underground, not care about the regulations, and not care about the taxes? And you see what happened, actually, the analogy to this is with the legalization of marijuana. You see some states that have done it already. They already have a legal area, and they have a robust illegal trade, because they want to undersell the legal trade, and they're, again, living in the dark, so we have no idea what's going on.
I also think there's a bit of unintended consequences in the sense that if you're in a state with legalized prostitution, and let's say you're a prostitute, you're a sex worker, and something goes wrong, perhaps that there's a sex act that goes too far, you get injured, are you going to be able to go to the police? Are they really going to take it seriously? They're going to be like, well, prostitution is legal in your state, in your jurisdiction. It's not going to create a context in which it's taken seriously. Likewise, if you're running an establishment, you're running a brothel, are you going to be inclined to report if there are any issues? No. And why are you going to report? Because then it's going to take away business.
Yeah, I mean,
so it's an unintended consequences. There's a lot of double-edged swords here.
Yeah, I mean, are the women who are hurt in the course of prostitution, we'll talk a little bit about the level of violence in a minute, are they going to be able to file workmen's compensation claims? Will their employer have workers' comp insurance? Will they have health benefits? Give me a break. Of course not. It's just, when they say that regulation will make the workplace safer, it's a goal. I think they intend, sincerely to advance that. But the reality is it will not work. And the girls, prostitutes, will be in at least as bad a state as they are now.
Yes, and I think from New Zealand, there's some statistics here, but a lot of, let's say, prostitutes that are in New Zealand, that's where it's legalized, they're noting that a lot of these legal brothels fail to keep women safe because, again, they're rarely reporting the violence that's occurring because it's bad for business. So again, legalization might be the ideal in the sense that, this is going to be now safe prostitution, but in practice, that's not, necessarily the case.
And the women, the prostitutes, won't have any more freedom either. They'll be just as much under the thumb of the promoters as they are now.
And I also want to make a comment about, let's say, working and the labor laws and all that. Now, again, most of you probably know the distinction between if you're a regular employee versus an independent contractor. So in this bill that's going to be put forth for legalization, we hope it doesn't happen, but it's leaving room for prostitutes to be considered independent contractors, and that's how they are normally being viewed. But at the same time, they're really working essentially as employees. And why is that important? That's important because if you're an employee, you have a lot less control. So if you're an employee in a brothel, the brothel is setting the work hours, the prices, the dress codes. It's not...
And the menu of services.
So it's not like this wonderful thing, and I think that's what is particularly problematic because it doesn't say, it leaves a lot of room for prostitutes to be exploited in this both independent contractor versus employee context, because it's saying that, you're going to be an independent contractor, great, but then your brothel is still going to treat you as an employee. We're going to be subjected to all of these things.
And it also gives the prostitutes even less control over what happens than even now.
Yes, and in states really places, countries where this has been legalized. So what has happened in workplaces? Well, first of all, there's been decreases in prices for, let's say, different sex acts. So I guess, economics, law, supply and demand regulation. And then this is also what I find kind of amusing. In Germany, what they've created now is these flat rate mega brothels. And again, forgive me for vulgarity, but has to be said. So in Germany, they have the Pussy Club, where it's advertised, and this is a literal quote, where you can have sex with all women as long as you want, as often as you want, and the way you want. And that's legal there. This is an advertisement for a real, live, legal thing. So I don't know, working conditions, that doesn't seem to be that good.
Yeah, so imagine, the John comes in and he puts his money down, all inclusive. He can do anything he wants to that prostitute. And she has no way to say no because he already paid. And she's under the control of the brothel owner.
I think that there's also general concern that you just transcend this law. So I think that there is a bit of an inherent power imbalance between, let's say, the prostitute and the John, the prostitute and the man, just by nature of prostitution. And then if you're going to then legalize it, you're kind of enshrining into law a lot of those power imbalances. So is that something that you really want? Is that going to help the condition of women? Is it really possible to have this, equal type of prostitution where women are being empowered and it's all going to be great and the prostitutes are going to be on equal standing with the pimps and the Johns? It seems a bit of a wishful thinking.
Yeah, it's kind of funny that people who are promoting these bills for the most part are consider themselves progressives, and yet they are, in this context, they're about as free marketers as you can get. I mean, the idea that the relationship between the prostitute and the pimp, or the prostitute and the John, is what the lawyers call an arm's length transaction. Now, honestly, there's the Sex Act, it's not an arm's length, but and that we're equal parties able to bargain and negotiate on equal footing. It's ridiculous. I mean, it doesn't even pass the laugh test when you consider what really is bringing these prostitutes into that kind of work. And again, going back to the idea of what the law should be doing and what we as a society should be doing, shouldn't we be protecting these very vulnerable people from this raw form of economic exploitation? I mean, we have robust labor laws in the United States and in the States in general. Are we really going to throw these people under the bus just so some men can have sex in whatever way they want? Is that really just and right in a society?
Yeah, and I think to that point, I mean, it's hard sometimes to get accurate or correct data and statistics on it, because there's going to be a lot of advocates that are going to say, well, in countries where it's been legalized, it's been safe, and then you're going to get conflicting, statistics, you're going to get conflicting information, so it's hard to ascertain. So while Ed and I were preparing for discussion, what I did is I looked at some of the countries where it's legalized, particularly in Europe, and that's several countries, but the most liberal states that have legalized prostitution would be Germany, the Netherlands, Austria, Switzerland, Hungary, Greece, Latvia, and Turkey. And then obviously other places around the world, New Zealand, Indonesia, Colombia, Venezuela, and then there's other countries, let's say France and Italy, where they have a bit of a mixed system where the actual prostitute is allowed to work, but then brothels are outlawed. Now, again, how is that working in practice? I don't know. But as we were trying to prepare for this, I read through some of the government reports and reporting. And one of the things that I found specifically in the Netherlands, which was interesting, so this was a 2008 government report, and it was estimating that 50 to 90% of women working in the brothels were victims of trafficking. And then the report was then going on to say, okay, well, we have laws in the Netherlands, should they be now improved going forward? Because it does seem to be that we're not accounting for the trafficking within the brothels. And then similarly in Germany, this was a 2007 government report, they found that the Prostitution Act, which was what legalized prostitution essentially in Germany, did not improve the working conditions for prostitutes in practice and did not reduce crime. So again, those are government reports, but again, you're going to get conflicting opinions, but it seems to be that at least these countries and states with full legalization, that doesn't seem to be the way forward. It seems to be just way too much, and it doesn't really seem to protect women from exploitation.
Right, it doesn't live up to the promises that they make. The promises that it'll be better for the prostitutes, they'll have better working conditions, less violence, less trafficking, and they just don't deliver. So if the experiment fails elsewhere, why in the world would we try it here?
So that's an issue. Now, again, from Catholics, okay, we have to think about, we have obviously a lot of Aquinas' principles in the background, we have some of this data from other countries. I think, though, ideally, we should be advocating for a system in which, again, actual prostitutes, sex workers, they're not being penalized. And if they are being penalized, it's only to the effect of getting them out of the system, in the sense that they're getting arrested, not because they're going to be in jail, but because the law is going to provide them with some sort of pathway forward. But I don't think that those are the people, the prostitutes should not be the people that we're targeting in the law, because that's not helping them. But I would say, specifically in New York, that when we're dealing with these pimps, these johns, these brothels, etc., in the event they would be legalized or whatever, that's what we want to target. So I think that to say, that should be decriminalized is not helpful. So I think that those, like the way in which the law is written currently, in which, we are outlawing the brothels and the buying of sex, that should remain. I think that that's not, wrong. I don't think that that's regressive. I think that that's the best outcome in order to limit the amount of prostitution and to ensure the safety of women involved.
Yeah, and the law, the criminal law at least, is a blunt instrument. And it really, it's kind of like the hammer and the nail, right? If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So the criminal justice system, the only solution is to put people in jail. That's pretty much the solution. Whatever response is made, and something that we don't do now really very effective at all, really, is there needs to be a sustained outreach and service to the prostitutes. It has to be clearly stated and put out there that there are options for them, that there are people to help them, and that there are ways that they can be helped so that they can voluntarily walk away and not suffer. They know that they will be better off if they come in from the cold, basically. We don't do that, really. Some religious orders have done it. There have been groups of religious sisters around the country and also here in New York even who have done this. But the government does virtually nothing. It's about as effective as our homeless work, right? You can all see how effective that is. And our drug addiction work, you can see how effective that is. Dealing with these social problems by the criminal law is using probably the least effective, not completely ineffective, but the least effective mechanism for dealing with it.
And I do think, okay, again, I don't want to see a total legalized concept here in New York where just everything is illegal, but I think there is a bit of an opening for, let's say, a restorative justice in the sense that, okay, if we are going to have, pimps and johns being targeted, perhaps they even have to serve some jail time, but can we have a framework in which there is a bit of a, some sort of reckoning where they can actually hear the perspectives of the prostitutes that have been violated, to actually know where they're coming from, why that they entered prostitution, how they were exploited, and have a bit of a transformative element to that. So I think that the law, or at least in New York, we would be open to these types of arrangements. But by no way, at least from my perspective, based on Catholic principles, would a whole framework of complete legalization and decriminalization be in the best interests of women and prostitutes.
Yeah, and in the UK they've tried, usually when people go after the Johns, it's a name and shame thing, right? They publish their names in the newspaper, they put their pictures on the TV news, it's a name and shame thing, and that doesn't work. In the UK they've tried a different approach. They have the men who are arrested for patronizing, they bring them in and they do exactly what Alexis said. They have a program for them where they face them with the reality of what they're doing. It's not just a 5-minute sexual encounter. You are participating and contributing and promoting a whole way of life that is damaging people. And they've found that approach very effective in reducing recidivism among the people who patronize. I think most people, I'm a cynical person, but I still think most people have an element of good in them. And I think that most people, especially if you expose them to what really is going on, I think that they will at the very least reconsider, if not turn themselves around again.
And I think we also, at this point, we want to pivot a little bit about now pornography. And is that then connected with this topic of prostitution? And if so, how would it be connected?
Yeah, you can't really look at prostitution as an isolated phenomenon. Prostitution is part of a much larger social problem. There is an entire, sometimes it's called the adult entertainment industry, which to me is going to a baseball game, but no, it's the sex industry. And the sex industry is gigantic. It includes prostitution, pornography, massage parlors, cyber sex, all these kinds of things, webcams, all of these kinds of, it's a gigantic industry here in the United States. Estimates are hard because it's mostly illegal, but some of the experts who have studied this put it at somewhere in the vicinity of at least $5 billion a year and as much as $15 or $16 billion a year. And to put that in context, the NFL is about a $14 billion a year business. So this is at least as large. It's certainly larger than a lot of industries we would take for granted. It's big in the snack food industry, which is nice over there, a lot of our snacks. The odd thing is that, at least with respect to prostitution, there's only a small number of people who are participating in this. The various studies have tried to show, get a sense of what's the demand side of this. Very small percentage. They're saying that some of the experts I've read were saying somewhere around the range of about 4% of American men have patronized a prostitute in the last few years. But the interesting thing is that the majority of them are repeat patronizers. So as with a lot of vices, there are a lot of people who dabble, but most people don't. Many people dabble. Some people really are into it. It's like gambling. Pornography, of course, is also a gigantic industry. It's unbeliable how widespread pornography is, and as an economic entity. I looked at research that there are 3 porn sites among the top 20 websites in the entire world in terms of traffic, right? One of them is called 8 billion visits a month to these porn sites. One's called, well, I'm not going to give you the name of it because then you'll look at it. But it's the top one, 3.3 billion visits a month, which is more than Amazon. Another one is 2.5 billion, which is more than TikTok. And the most famous one, I'll mention it because everybody's probably heard of it, Pornhub. It's in the news a lot. 2.3 billion, which is more than Zoom.
This is in the US or worldwide?
In the world. Yeah. So we're talking about a gigantic, and some of these are free, but a lot of them are subscription, and that means there's people making a lot of money off of this industry. Now, the issue with pornography, of course, is that it shapes our sexuality. It distorts our view of sexuality. It changes the way we look at each other. It changes the way that we behave. And one of the particular ways that pornography is dangerous and how it exactly tracks into prostitution is that it forms what the experts call sexual scripts, right? Sexual scripts. It's this idea that's formed in someone's mind of how I want to act, how I want my partner to act, how this encounter is going to play out. And, it's not just, I want to have sex with a pretty girl. It's much more involved than that. And the themes in pornography are very important for this. And the themes in pornography, to a great extent, are extremely degrading and dangerous and violent. You know what some of the top searches are in these porn websites? Overall, the top searches, believe it or not, are for teens, which is to say minors, right? Or people who look like minors, and subjects related to incest, right? So this is the kind of thing that is shaping people. And these sexual scripts all involve the dehumanization of women. Women in pornography are not real people. They're objects, right? They're two-dimensional entities, basically. It's funny, Pope John Paul said that one of the problems with pornography isn't that we see too much, which we do, of course, it's that we see too little.
We don't see enough.
We don't see enough. We don't see the person. We don't see this is someone's daughter, someone's son, someone's hopefully wife, mother someday. Someone with the same desire for love that I have. Right? It's been twisted and distorted, but it's the same. This is my brother or sister in Jesus Christ, right? Who we see in these things.
And I think the big issue and the connection is obviously the violence now. And this is what a lot of prostitutes talk about, is what they're being expected to do, and they specifically say that they're expected to engage in violent sex acts because their clients have seen that in pornography and want that repeated. So pornography then is creating demand, creating certain things that, want to be done. That goes to a little bit of what Ed is saying, that, okay, there's a certain script, there's a certain expectation that's been, cultivated through pornography, but then now we have prostitution as the means to act that out with a real person.
Yeah, and when that happens, the prostitute can't really say no to that. I mean, consent really is not part of the job description, and consent is not always part of the sexual script. In fact, in many, many cases, consent is deliberately being overcome in those scripts. The amount of violence in mainstream pornography is shocking.
Yeah, we have some statistics.
It's not just, men and women having sex with each other.
So 88.2% contain physical aggression, principally spanking, gagging, hair pulling, and slapping. So that's
Say it slow. You say it too fast.
88.2%.
Gagging, choking.
And that's in mainstream pornography.
And slapping.
And then
this is during sex acts.
And then 48.7% of scenes, and this is mainstream pornography, this is not like some sort of niche pornography, contain verbal aggression, primarily name-calling, and aggression, usually like men, it's men against women type aggression, so these males are being aggressive against female.
Yeah, almost all the victims of this aggression that is seen are women.
97%.
In mainstream porn, we're not talking about gay porn, that's a different phenomenon entirely. But a lot of these things, one of the studies I read was, they looked at the videos that you first see when you hit on Pornhub. That's a free visit. You get the first one free. To get in, I think you have to pay. And something like 1 out of 8 of the videos, right on the front page, involved violence or degradation towards women. So they're enticing people in with this and encouraging them to act that way. And of course, this has a dramatic effect, as Alexis said, on the sexual script and then what people want to act out when they are with prostitutes. The prostitutes then are not allowed to say no. Men who view these things tend to act out the aggression, act out the violence. They tend to believe what's called the rape myth. In other words, that women actually like to be raped. And what happens then is the prostitutes themselves report all of these things happening to them. It's amazing when they do surveys of prostitutes across the world. Large percentages of them, in some studies as much as 90%, will say they were raped at some point. A lot of people, how can a prostitute be raped? Yeah, she's raped. Or they're assaulted or threatened. And a lot of this is being taught by pornography. It causes the women to want to leave the business of prostitution because they understand. I mean, when you're treated this way, you're being dehumanized and violated. And consent and the old statement, the happy hooker, there's no such thing. So when we talk about legalizing or decriminalizing prostitution, or not prosecuting, promoting, or things like that, this is what we are legalizing. This is what we as a society are saying is okay to happen. And in fact, once you start regulating it, in a way you're saying, not only is it a good thing, but we want it done in a particular way, and we as a society, because we're going to tax it, want to profit from this. We wiped out the slave trade. We're still actually fighting against slavery, but these prostitutes are slaves, and we are profiting off of them if we legalize.
Now, to bring this back to Aquinas, now we're going to get controversial here. So people often make the argument, Aquinas said that, prostitution should be allowed or should be acceptable in order to prevent, greater evils. Now, I think there's a few different ways to answer that. So oftentimes, Aquinas is in line with church teaching. He's a doctor of the church, he's a wonderful saint, but not always, not 100, I would say maybe about 99% of the time. So there are some cases in which Catholic teaching is at odds with what Aquinas was saying, if we look at actual magisterium. But I think in his context, it's hard to say, there's differences now. So, okay, he would say, okay, we're allowing this to be legal in order to prevent, a greater evil. So what would that greater evil be? Like, I'm trying to think about this with you all now. So what would be the greater evil? Because if prostitution, even if it's legal, is violent, so what are we preventing? Like women being just raped constantly on the street? I'm not sure what would be the greater evil. So I think that analogy would apply to today's context would be a bit hard.
Yeah, traditionally that was one of the arguments, was that it reduces the amount of rape. No, that's just not true. There's a direct correlation between pornography use, especially, and patronizing prostitutes and rape levels. That's just a statistical reality.
So again, clients would say, okay, those in authority rightly tolerate the existence of certain evils, i.e. prostitution, in order to prevent greater evils. But again, I don't know what the greater evil would be. I mean, it's violent and degrading, even in the legal form. So I don't know. I don't know here. I don't think that would work in a contemporary context. But
some people say that some people have argued that it is an outlet for male sexuality if they're not being satisfied in their marriage, and rather than degrade their wife, they have another outlet for their sexuality.
I don't know how many women would buy that.
No, I don't know many men trying to sell it either.
I do think that, Aquinas' line of thinking does leave room for, I guess, decriminalization in the sense that, okay, that we shouldn't be going after the prostitutes. We don't want them to be the subject of the law or the primary focus. So maybe along those lines, Aquinas is giving a little bit of latitude for a decriminalizing argument, at least when it involves a specific sex worker.
Yeah, and there are arguments that the prosecution and the enforcement against prostitution does have negative effects. It's commonly associated with corruption of the police or the courts. It's very common for there to be violence and bribery on the part towards police officers not to be arrested and things like that. The cash that it generates is used for organized crime. Sometimes it's really controlled, especially in the ethnic community, the Chinese community, and the Russian communities and things like that. Very heavily is prostitution controlled by organized crime. It was traditionally controlled in New York by the Italian mafia.
Lucky Luciano, that's how he was brought down, for those of you who don't know, through prostitution.
Yep.
And from there, his entire empire. Yes. But that's how they went after.
Right. So the enforcement, just the amount of cash that's generated, of course, leads to corruption. And that is also a problem of enforcement.
Yeah. So then what does we as Catholics should do? Okay, obviously, we shouldn't be supporting prostitution and pornography. I mean, I think that's very basic. But I do think that what we can do in our everyday life, like suppose we're not really involved in any of this, I do think that we have to encourage people to understand that God has a better vision of sexuality for us. Like there is, even in the most destitute of economic, circumstances, God does not want you to be doing that, to be degrading yourself, to be engaged in that. And I think some people might feel that the church's understanding or vision of sexuality is just too much, it's not attainable, it's not realistic. But ultimately, that's what's best for us. So if we personally, in our everyday lives, believe that's true and then live accordingly, I think that helps the entire ethos of society, or at least the people who we come in contact with.
Yeah, and I think also there are some pragmatic things that we can do as Catholics. We can support organizations that fight against human trafficking and that support people escaping from trafficking and prostitution. Is one very well known one called Polaris. It's one of the more famous ones. We can make sure our legislators know where we stand on this. We don't have to stand by quietly while they legalize prostitution. We can contact our legislators. The New York State Catholic Conference has an email activization network where you can get emails about things and you can contact your legislator. It's important that they hear from us that we don't want this to happen.
Yeah. Okay, so then we want to open up for questions. Is that okay? So questions, comments.
Before the separate questions along, but can you is there a distinction between decriminalization versus legalization, or is it the same?
Yeah, decriminalization basically means you revoke some of the elements of the penal law so that some crimes are not going to be prosecuted anymore. That's decriminalization. Legalization, I mean, the term legalization tends to be used for that also, but strictly speaking, legalization means you wipe all the prostitution laws off the books, and you may or may not then regulate it as like an industry or as a
So
as a
for
profession.
example, that's the case in Germany. Like, it really is legalized in Germany, in which it's regulated like a profession, whereas in other contexts, certain elements are decriminalized. So for example, if there was a specific statute going against a prostitute, and it's decriminalized and it won't be enforced. So I kind of look at things that, okay, you have illegal on one hand, decriminalization or elements of decriminalization in the middle, and then just outright legalization on the other side. That's kind of how I mean, there's a bit of an overlap, but that's kind of how I look at it a bit.
Yeah, and one of the things about the public debate is it's like a false dichotomy. People, the advocates of the legalization say, well, it's either what we're doing now, which is terrible, or it's full legalization, as if these were the only two options. And that's just not true. There's lots of other options involved. Like Alexis said, you can decriminalize some parts, you can increase outreach, you can actually enforce the law as it is. There's lots of different options. And, it's typical rhetorical trick to say, well, there's only two, it's only black or white, right? And it's rarely the case.
The way
Does that clarify it?
Yeah, it does, that's the way that I, like in terms of decriminalization, that's the way that I perceive that would probably be the best option for people in that industry. But it's true, it's not black and white, like when you say decriminalization, then it's like, zooming into like what's most understandable to be decriminalized, and how the process that would.
Yes. Yeah, and there's ways of partially decriminalizing what Alexis said. Just take certain parts of the law out. Maybe just the actual act of prostitution would be decriminalized. But it's, as I said before, I think it's irresponsible to do that without also increasing the outreach and social services and things.
Or having an exit strategy or something within the law that helps women transition out of this.
Yeah, because otherwise you're just cutting them loose and they're at the mercy of the industry, and that's, I think, just irresponsible, hypocritical.
So it seems like we're talking about decriminalization or lifting sanctions, but you mentioned something at the very beginning that was interesting. How do we define a crime? Because we were talking about decriminalization like it was nothing. We lift it, we put it back. How do we define a crime? I mean, if this is a crime, can we just say it's not a crime? Or you touched upon it a little bit at the beginning.
Well, that's a good question, actually. Not under Catholic moral theology, let's leave that aside for a second, because that's a little bit different, but under the law, our American law, criminal, it's just a category of behavior that we have decided is so bad that it's worthy of punishment or imprisonment or something like that. So it's just, and then there's all sorts of other lesser acts that we also make illegal, but they are what we call civil offenses. So you might be sued for it, or you might be fined for it, or something like that. But it's really just a distinction of degree and not of crime. And there's different levels of crime too. There's felonies, there's misdemeanors, there's all sorts of things. But I guess
in the American context, criminal versus legal. I mean, criminal versus civil. So obviously, criminal has the potential of jail time versus civil. You're more dealing with, being sued, something like that. For the purposes of the criminal law, then you would have a list of behaviors that can potentially have jail time. So let's say different levels of murder, manslaughter, etc., different things, different levels of theft, all that, and then prostitution would be listed as one of those crimes. So then to decriminalize it would be, okay, the actual act of prostitution would not in itself be a crime, but then perhaps you would still criminalize, let's say, pimps, johns, etc. That's how we would get there. Again, but that's from like an American legal perspective. Now, if you want to talk about a Catholic moral perspective, well, what's the nature of a crime? Well, then that's a more of a theological and philosophical conversation.
Yeah, what most people think of as crimes are the traditional things you would think of: murder, robbery, burglary, arson, assault, those kinds of things. I mean, under American law, we have criminalized an unbelievable amount of stuff. Under federal and state law, you can pretty much guarantee that everybody in this room has committed at least one crime today, because virtually everything is criminal. But hopefully you'll never get arrested for it. So does that help? It's just it's really not a clearly conceived and discrete category. It's again just a degree of seriousness.
Yeah, one thing that I had in mind was one specific example. If I think of it as something that destroys family, right? So this destroys family. The fact remains whether it's legal or not. It's something that attacks the core of society. Now, the family is already attacked, so probably it doesn't hold water, but it's terrible. In that sense, the crime or the fact that this destroys family, the unity of the family, it remains, whether you make it legal or not. I mean,
I'm gonna call on the ones that had their hands up first, second, third, fourth, okay, just to make a little bit of an order here. So would you like to say your question and you're next? And then someone in the back there.
Okay, thank you. Who are the kinds of people pushing for this?
Okay, so there are two groups that I had alluded to earlier. So there's advocates that view prostitution as not in a way, they think that if it's legalized, women aren't going to be harmed, so therefore we need to legalize it, to regulate it, to make it better, and this is something that can be good and empowering towards women. This is a legitimate means of employment. So that's, I guess, a group of advocates. Now, on the other hand, there are people that are, I guess, we would consider just super progressive and just feel that most or really everything related to sexuality really should not be restrained. So they're not really focused on how this would impact women, but the fact that civil society should not have laws relating to sexuality. And if a person so chooses to make a living in this way, well, there's nothing that the law should do to prevent that. So there's kind of two different groups of advocates that would be, pushing for legalization.
And there's also, a general movement in the United States, especially on the progressive side of the political wing, to reduce the number of crimes that are being prosecuted, to reduce the number of people who go to jail, and to seek other ways of dealing with problems other than sending people to jail. So there's a bunch of different kinds of groups.
Who are the consumers of pornography mostly, and then even prostitution?
Men.
I mean, it's predominantly male. I mean, again, there's different niches and types of pornography. I mean, predominantly male, if you want to talk about age of it.
Well, pornography starts
It's a wide range from very young
to old. Most people who are being arrested for patronizing prostitutes are they're men. They are in their, from what I've seen, it's about curve, I guess, a little bit. Men who are slightly on the older group, in 30s and 40s age group. Less so younger men, and less so older men. So that's sort of early middle age kind of.
For prostitution.
For prostitution.
And then for pornography, I mean, people are exposed at a very young age, and then talk about primary, I mean, do you know the statistics offhand for primary consumers with the age group would be teenagers. Yeah.
Thank you, Alexis, and that is a
Thanks,
very deep topic. When you think about it. Actually, I have two. One is a question just for the legal side, because also for myself as an RN, when you're dealing with people who may have been raped or sex assault. So just out of curiosity, here in New York State, is it just like penetrative sex when it comes to prostitution? Because, for example, in terms of sexual expression, from my understanding, let's say if someone is into BDSM and there's a master dominatrix, I believe those are legalized sex professions here in New York State. So is it only referencing to intercourse, actual sexual intercourse?
It's let's see. Right now, before this law would change the definition a little bit. It would change it to any sex act, which is a little bit broader. Right now, it is, if you'll pardon my expression, but oral, anal, or vaginal sex. I believe there may be any sexual act would include an awful lot of things, right? But I believe that for the most part, it's those three things, I think, is how they define prostitution in the law.
And then the second point, because you mentioned Alexis, like with the point of St. Thomas Aquinas, like I think that's interesting because like most of these countries that you had mentioned, they're usually like these like westernized countries where Catholicism or Christianity in general has kind of fallen a bit more towards like a more secularized kind of lifestyle. And it's interesting because like you guys had brought up like with gambling, because I'm thinking, for example, like with the legalization of gambling, I mean, I personally, I think most of us could say like gambling to me just seems like a sin, a waste of like resources where people could be actually using their money to like maybe fund homeless shelters or social services. But it's like, I'm thinking like as they legalized gambling, like for example in New Jersey in the 1970s when they came to Atlantic City, and maybe I'm looking at it from a more like kind of libertarian, like individualistic kind of side, because it's like, obviously overall I think gambling is a waste for society, but there are people who go individually to these casinos in Atlantic City and they just go there for their fun and entertainment. The state of New Jersey is generating a lot of revenue. And if you legitimately have a problem where you're just compulsively gambling, the state allegedly will have these programs to help you. So it's like, it's one of those things where like prostitution, where it's like, some of these Johns, they legitimately have this problem where they, have these fetishes and they may turn into rapists. And as you said, some of them may just want to go for their sexual expression. So it's like, it's a kind of thorny subject, because I'm thinking like if you legalize it, as you had mentioned, maybe then you want to have these characters like the mafia or like other black market, enterprises take over. And even if it is wishful thinking, I'm thinking if they legalize the prostitution, if there's some way where they can make it, let's say, with a compensation at least financially fair, a risk of STDs, even though from our Catholic moral perspective, obviously it's still not the best solution. I'm just thinking that I think the legalization may be a little better. That's how I'm looking at it, as you said, Alexis, from the reverse.
That's actually probably about as good an argument that as can be made, and that is being made by the advocates. That's basically the argument.
And I'm not even a lawyer. Because that's just the way I'm thinking about it, like as respective to like gambling.
Yeah. Well, and the distinction, though, of course, is that when I gamble, I'm not using a person as an element of chance, right? I'm just betting against the possibility of an event happening, I guess, Whereas with prostitution, I'm actually using another person for a purpose. So certainly from a moral, and I think even from a legal perspective, that's one way to draw the distinction.
I would say that too, and then also, how much, obviously when gambling gets out of control, it could become crazy, violent. I mean, maybe there's a culture of I'm drinking and gambling, but I don't know, I feel like with legalized prostitution, you're still going to have a violence to it, and I don't know if there would really be an analogous element with gambling that we could really correlate and say, okay, well, we've had legalized gambling and there could be some problems, but then it's been beneficial. This one, I don't know how that would translate. What would be the variable that would be, analogous?
Yeah,
I don't know if that would really be fixed, because it still would be violent even in a legal context. Whereas gambling is a bit different. Yeah,
I think that's right. Nobody attacks the blackjack dealer, even if they lose.
Okay. One question that I have, although I am inclined toward your conclusions, I'm not sure that you necessarily justified one of your premises, which is this idea of a plurality, or I think you suggested a majority, if not the entirety, of the women involved are victims per se. Just to give a few examples, certainly in a online context, it's interesting that you brought up pornography, because I might be inclined to think that in some of these, more novel pornography contexts, that the women involved might be more free agents. They might have more opportunities for autonomy and therefore to be outside of the traditional pimp structure that you alluded to. So certainly in those particular cases, I would love to get your thoughts whether the premise still holds. But also even in the more traditional model that you've articulated, I'm wondering what your basis of that is other than intuition. I believe one of the figures you alluded to was a 50 to 90% figure in one particular country that women were the victims of human trafficking. But it seems to me that it would be a very difficult thing to know the extent to which women are kind of actively agents and therefore choosing to be involved with these morally depraved acts.
Well, the second question is probably a little easier.
Right.
Most criminal justice experts, and certainly the New York State, this is right on the New York State Criminal Justice Department of Criminal Justice Services website talking about human trafficking, they say that there is essentially no difference between human trafficking and just regular promoting prostitution, because the great majority of the women are experiencing force, coercion, or manipulation. As far as, you can look at there's an organization called the National Committee to End Sexual Exploitation, I think, NCOS. They have all sorts of statistical studies. I encourage you to take a look at them. Studies from all around the world where prostitutes are interviewed and the extent to which they were manipulated into it or forced into it by boyfriends or, unfortunately, family members. The typical way that minors get involved in prostitution is they're pimped by relatives, for example. The first part, there is certainly a niche and a section of people who go into sex work voluntarily, and they like it. Some of the advocates for legalization of prostitutes are people either former prostitutes or current prostitutes. So there's always some.
But that's not the majority. I also think that there's a now growing idea, we've heard of it, of ethical porn. So why does that exist? That exists because it seems to be that the default is unethical porn, or a context in which people are not doing this voluntarily or how they want to, how, let's say, women really want to, so that was created as a subset. So, for example, then people think it's justifiable that I'm watching now ethical porn because the women there, they're doing this consensually, whereas in mainstream pornography, they don't. But if we look at it, get statistics about the production of porn, how it happens, if you look at people that are paid in it, and you would to survey them, a lot of them are doing this. Yes, you will have, again, as I alluded to, a niche that are doing this because they want to, but the vast majority are not doing it. If you look at the production of it, if you look at all the sites where it's being produced, that's not, the most high quality. This is people that are looking to make money on the side, and they're just getting women who are willing to do that. Yeah. So I know. Yeah,
and even in the say like the webcam business, for example, where there's no physical contact, so therefore no element of violence or potential for violence, there still is an element of economic coercion, because I'm paying you to do something, and if you don't do it, I'm not going to pay you, right? So there's always this economic impulse. And that economic impulse is always going to go downwards as far as what the person, the seller, is willing to sell. The inducement is always going to be sell more, or I won't be able to get money. Which is actually typical of the cycle of pornography, because people tend to go down the cycle towards more and more degrading stuff. Most of the women who are in webcams have done it to escape prostitution.
What about, if I may have a quick follow-up, what about OnlyFans? Are you familiar with that? Because I thought that when you mentioned the top 20 sites, I'm not sure, but I think it's
way far down.
Okay, fair enough.
But you might be alluding to that might be a niche of people that they're doing it willingly in order to gain. If that's what you're going at. That we're not when there are people that are waiting on when so-and-so turns 18 or a certain age. Yeah, I think that there are people that are doing this willingly, but I think the vast majority still isn't. But if we do want to highlight that, it is worth to say. But I think that then that raises further issues. That if you want to do this willingly, then I think it's very sad that you then are not exposed to a better vision of sexuality. I think that it's a tragedy.
Yeah, and it's also, you know, when you think about what is work for, I think this is now more from a Catholic perspective, what's the purpose of work? The purpose of work is to give expression to my creative impulses and my ability to do things and make things, and so that I can support myself, my family, and so that I can develop my potential as best I can. That's the purpose of work. You know, I just can't see any way that I could fit any kind of sex work into that framework. You know, the expiration date for a person in pornography is really short, right? The expiration date of people in prostitution is very short. It's not a lifetime career. And it doesn't really lead to anything fulfilling.
And again, from a Catholic perspective, okay, again, the secular world will not necessarily accept this, but a Catholic perspective of, again, what sex is. It couldn't, from the Catholic perspective, that's not even something by its nature that really could be bought or sold. I mean, it just has such value, such sacredness to it. Now, again, people object to that, but at least from a Catholic perspective, that just doesn't even make sense.
So Lucy, and then Josh, and then
Fran.
and then we might have to, I mean, we'll see how much time we have. I know we can't keep it here all night, so.
So what I was gonna say is like kind of a comment on like that kind of thing. Like the reason why the gambling analogy doesn't really work for me is that, you know, the whole thing that you were saying about Catholic perspective is like the whole thing about God's design is what sex is, what marriage is, and it's hard to accept, but it's at the same time, it doesn't line up with gambling, because even the worst arguments against gambling do not, you know, it's just not the same thing as, you know, like a distorted view of sexuality or something. So it's hard to see it on those lines. It's probably the best example there could be, but if you really, really had to make it legal to do any kind of sex work or any kind of thing like that, is that maybe the OnlyFans option, like make that legal, but if there's any proof that there's a guy coercing you into this, or girl, or whoever is being a ringleader of some sort over like a bunch of girls or guys or whatever, like if they have a harem of some kind, just like knock it out, just like arrest them, make that illegal, is that in any way feasible? Is there a workable legal path towards something like that? But make sure, like, if you're exploiting yourself, that's fine, but not really. It won't be fine from like a
moral perspective,
more
secular perspective.
But from the secular perspective of perhaps making this legal and finding the best common ground between morality and secularism as possible and free choice, that could be the route to go.
Well, the porn sites, and I believe OnlyFans also, I wouldn't count, OnlyFans is not just a porn site, OnlyFans has a lot of other stuff involved in it, but they do a terrible job of screening people out for age, for example, the consumer and the user, and the person who's in the performance. They have a major problem, all of these websites have major problems with the continual uploading of child rape videos. I don't use the term child pornography, by the way. It's a child rape video. They also have continual problems with uploading actual rape of adult videos. They can't be trusted to police themselves, certainly, because they don't care.
Yeah, so I think in practice that would, because I think your analogy, if you're trying to like reach a compromise with the secular world, could there be, you know, something that's, could there be a legal option and what would be the best? And you gave that example of like maybe that would work, I think, theoretically, but I think to Ed's point, it would be hard in practice because of a lot that slips under the cracks, and now there's this whole thing. And we didn't really want to get into this, but that if you're a platform versus you're the creator, and then there's legal issues about it, and this was a whole issue about age. So then there are people that are posting videos with children or other really like vile things, but then the platform says, well, you know, it's not our business to police it because we're not the creator of it. So it could there could be dicey issues in that respect.
Yeah, if they start to edit the content, then they undermine some of their legal immunity from lawsuits. It's a complicated legal issue. Sorry. But, you know, every one of the social media sites has a terrible problem with porn and with child rape videos and other things. I mean, Twitter has a big problem with it, Facebook has a problem with it, Instagram does.
Because the platform versus the actual creator.
Really hard to police when anybody can upload from anywhere. Yeah.
So I wanted to say something before asking my question, but like in regards to OnlyFans, everyone thinks that there's like this, or there might be a thought that there's women who choose to go into this, and I haven't researched this as much as you, obviously, but even when they want to go into OnlyFans and stuff like that, it's still coercion by just lies. Because I'm pretty sure most women who are on OnlyFans make less than $100 a month. So they see these women who somewhat make a living off of it. It's like 0.1% of the creators on that. And that's just like the upper echelon of that group. And every woman buys into the idea that they're going to make a living off this, when really they're just destroying their lives with like $1,000 a year or something like that. And secondly, I just wanted to ask, is if prostitution is decriminalized, can that be taxed by the government?
Sure. Prostitution income is already taxable income.
Oh.
So it's funny. Anything you make from crime is taxable income.
So the government always seeks the profit, no matter what.
That's how they got Al Capone, right? By not filing his tax returns. But yeah, and your point is well taken about. I watched there was a documentary a few years ago called Hot Girls Wanted, and it was about a service down in, this guy down in Miami who induced young ladies to come down there and get involved in porn. And it was sold by the whole thing, glamorous life, lots of money, all this kind of stuff. And it was a disaster for every one of them because they didn't make a lot of money. They felt degraded, they had all sorts of physical and psychological problems, relational problems. It was a disaster. The only one who made out was the pimp.
So my question is kind of about definition of terms, and I think you did this at the beginning, but I kind of wanted to ask this question anyway. A distinction between prostitution and sex work, because I think the way I'm sort of picturing this is that prostitution obviously is an old word with a very clear negative connotation, and then somewhere around 5 years ago, this phrase sex work popped up. And, put two words that are, sex is great, work is great, put them together, right? So to me it seems like a clever way to sanitize prostitution by sort of just replacing this word. Now, I could be wrong. If you actually feel like this phrase, sex work, describes something that maybe encompasses prostitution, I would like to hear your definition, but also kind of part of my question is, do you think we as Catholics ought to spend 5 minutes coming up with the term that still has a clear negative connotation and conveys what we want to say, right? Because maybe people hear prostitution and they say, well, there's more than that, massage parlors, OnlyFans, you need a different word. It's like, okay, fine, maybe we do, but it ought to still sound bad, just so people hear it and they're like, oh, that's
sex slavery.
Could be.
So I feel like that's it. I was thinking about that too, because terminology. So if you take more of like, I guess, a left-wing progressive, they would not like the term prostitution because it has that negative connotation. So they would use this as a sex worker. But me personally, when I use the term sex work, I use it to encompass prostitution, but also affiliated type of work. Let's say if you're working in some sort of massage parlor, if you're then producing, sex videos, you're doing something that's a little bit broader than just traditionally conceived prostitution. Now, I guess in order to if we're talking about terminology, I guess what could be more of a better way? A prostituted person, maybe? A person engaged in prostitution? I think, yes, we should be clear about our terms. So perhaps going forward, maybe we should say a person engaged in prostitution. I don't know, because then there could also be more negative connotations. I mean, then it seems disproportionately harmful to the woman, whereas, again, the other people involved, brothels, johns, pimps, etc., doesn't seem as negative. So I don't know, but I guess for me personally, when I say sex worker, I mean it larger than just the prostitute, but also people in affiliated type work.
Yeah, it's always a difficulty when you have a label, because the label tends, any label tends to dehumanize a little bit, or is reductive. The woman or man who is selling sex for money can't be reduced to just that as their identity. They're not just a prostitute. Yeah, they are a person engaged in prostitution. So I'm like, but that's very awkward to say over and over again. Person engaged in prostitution. It's easier to use the label. I agree with Alexis that sex work or sex worker is a little bit of a better term in a way, because it is more
encompassing.
And I doubt that there's ever going to be an elimination of stigma on sex work. I mean, if someone applied for a job and they said, for the last 5 years I've been a sex worker, I think no one's going to say, wow, that was a great experience for this job. You're really good at customer relations.
Customer relations.
Okay, and I think our last question, maybe there's a way we can continue the discussion on Facebook or under the video or something, but maybe Alexis and Ed may have some sort of way to communicate with you in the next maybe discussion discipleship. But we'll have one last question.
Hopefully this is more hopeful questions.
Good. I'm glad.
So thank you guys. But I had a question, and I know that we had talked about the Greeks who will get backpacks and stuff for a month before, and I talked to my dad about this. He's an ER physician in Illinois, and he said that there are options on their charts when a woman comes in who is suspected of having been trafficked, and you can flag it. And there are ways to have a conversation in code terms, essentially. He said he's never been successful getting one woman to leave because they're so hooked on drugs. From the minute they get into the brothels, that they will go after those. And so I was just wondering if you came across in the research any of the most successful models for helping women, be rehabilitated out of this.
Yeah, from what I've seen in the reading I've done, you're right on point. You need to address why is this woman why is she doing this, and what's keeping her there. So sometimes it's the same thing, like drug dependency. Or alcohol dependency, or past trauma is very often what's going on there. And then, is there something that is physically, for example, keeping her there? The coercion from the pimp. So the jobs, the ways that have been most successful in getting women to stay out of that is to get them out of the environment completely. It's very much like drug addiction or alcoholism. People's places and things. You get them out of that. It gives them a place to go to. There was a group of religious sisters who operated that house.
Dedicated to that, so maybe more of those types of settings. Yeah. Let's say homeless, let's say for drug addicts or halfway houses, things like that. You can do something similar for women that are trafficked, to kind of, again, different people, places, and things, take them out. They're now in this other setting. Hopefully we can help them deal with, say they have a drug problem or some sort of other trauma, and then help them transition to find, a different type of work so that they don't have to go back into that. So that's something I think that works well. We should see more of it.
Yes.
And I think, again, aside from a few groups and the religious order that you're referencing, there's not a lot of it. Because I think a lot of women are even scared to go into that. Like they might even, whereas I think sometimes with alcoholics, maybe because it's more well known, okay, well maybe I need to go to rehab, I need to go to halfway house. But for sex work, prostitution, victims of trafficking, all of the above, it seems even taking that first step is very hard to do.
Yeah. And of course, there's not that much support, right? Unlike Alcoholics Anonymous or things like that, there's not a lot of support groups of people who are coming out of this.
So you'd be afraid of the criminal record?
Yeah.
The criminal record is a problem, and in fact, some laws that are being passed around the country and are being considered here in New York would wipe out criminal records from before a certain time. I think in New York it would be 7 years for felony, 3 years for misdemeanor. So that helps. But you got to get them out of that. You got to deal with what put them there, and you got to deal with what's keeping them there. And some of these, society has not yet gotten into this mindset that we need to do that.
Just like, unlike, let's say, drugs, alcohol, etc., where we more have that mindset in society that we should be helping, so we're not there yet.
Yeah, but when it's tried, it works. The religious sisters who do this have a good record of success. What's the name of the sisters? I have to look it up. I can't remember. In fact, they won't even tell where their house is because
for
they're afraid,
privacy.
And they're afraid of the pimps going and grabbing the girls.
Thank you so much.
Okay.